He made an entire generation laugh with a trembling hand and a single bullet in his shirt pocket. But the man behind that shaking hand was fighting something real, something he rarely let the cameras see, and something his own daughter would spend years trying to help the world understand. This is the story of Don Knotts, the frightened boy who became one of television's most beloved faces, and the quiet battle he carried the entire way. To most of the world, Don Knotts was simply funny. He was the nervous deputy in Mayberry, the bug-eyed landlord in a hit sitcom, the man whose face alone could make an audience laugh before he even said a word. But comedy like that rarely comes from nowhere. Behind Don's most famous performances was a man who, by his own account and by the accounts of those closest to him, spent much of his life wrestling with nerves, self-doubt, and anxiety that never fully went away, even at the height of his fame. Jesse Donald Knotts was born on July 21, 1924, in Morgantown, West Virginia, the youngest of 4 brothers. His childhood was not an easy one. Money was tight, and the household was often tense. Don rarely spoke publicly about the details of his early home life, but those who wrote about him later, including biographers and his own daughter, described a boy who grew up quiet, watchful, and unsure of himself, a boy who learned early to read the mood of a room before he said a word. That same instinct, that habit of watching and waiting, would later become part of the comic timing that made him famous. As a child, Don discovered something that would shape the rest of his life. Alone in his room, he began experimenting with voices, faces, and little imaginary characters, entertaining himself long before he ever entertained an audience. By the time he reached his teenage years, he was performing as a ventriloquist and comedian at local school and church functions in Morgantown. It was a small start, but it planted the idea that maybe, just maybe, making people laugh could be more than a way to pass the time. It could be a way out. World War II interrupted whatever plans a young man from West Virginia might have had. Like so many others of his generation, Don was called into service. Rather than serving on the front lines, he found his place performing for troops, honing his comic timing in front of tired, homesick soldiers who needed a reason to smile. It was, in many ways, the first real stage he ever had, and it gave him something he had never quite had before: proof that people actually wanted to watch him perform. After the war, Don finished his education and moved to New York City, hoping to turn his wartime performances into an actual career. The early years were hard. Work was inconsistent, money was scarce, and rejection was common. He took small radio jobs, bit parts, anything that kept him in front of an audience, even a tiny one. It would take years of that slow, grinding persistence before anyone outside a handful of casting directors knew his name. That persistence eventually paid off in a way nobody could have predicted. In the 1950s, Don became a regular on The Steve Allen Show, performing as Mr. Morrison, a nervous man who could barely get a sentence out without falling apart. It was a strange sort of breakthrough. Audiences loved watching him struggle to keep it together. That nervous energy, so specific and so believable, was the same quality that would soon define the most important role of his career. That role came through a friendship. Don had crossed paths with a fellow performer named Andy Griffith years earlier, and the two shared an easy, natural rapport. When Griffith was given his own television show in 1960, he remembered his old friend and brought him on to play a small-town deputy named Barney Fife. It was meant to be a supporting part. Nobody involved could have guessed what was about to happen. Barney Fife became an instant sensation. His shaking hands, his one bullet kept carefully in his shirt pocket, his overblown sense of duty in a town where nothing ever really happened, all of it landed perfectly with audiences. Don won 5 Emmy Awards for the role, an extraordinary achievement for a supporting character on a half-hour sitcom. The Andy Griffith Show became one of the most successful series in television history, and Don Knotts, the quiet boy from Morgantown, was suddenly one of the most recognizable faces in America. What made Barney Fife so believable, according to people who knew Don personally, was how much of his real temperament lived inside the character. Don wasn't simply acting nervous. By multiple accounts, including his own writing later in life, he really was a naturally anxious, self-conscious, private man, and Barney Fife let him channel that part of himself into something audiences found funny rather than something he had to hide. It's a strange kind of gift, taking a real vulnerability and turning it into a performance millions of people love. But it also meant that, for Don, there wasn't always a clean line between the character and the man playing him. At the height of the show's success, Don made a decision that surprised a lot of people. He chose to leave the Andy Griffith Show to pursue film roles, a risky move for any actor walking away from a hit series. He went on to star in a string of comedies through the 1960s, including The Ghost and Mr. Chicken and The Reluctant Astronaut, playing variations on the same nervous, well-meaning everyman that had made him famous. Some of those films didn't find huge audiences right away, though several of them are now remembered fondly as genre classics. He also tried his hand at a variety show of his own, which didn't last long. Setbacks like these are a normal part of any long career, but for a man who, by his own description, already struggled with self-doubt, they weren't easy to shrug off. Don kept working steadily through the following decades. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, he found a new wave of popularity playing landlord Ralph Fruley on Three's Company, once again turning nervous energy and physical comedy into something audiences loved. He later reunited with Andy Griffith for guest appearances on Griffith's legal drama Matlock, a sign that the friendship the two men had built decades earlier had never really faded. Away from the screen, Don was known by friends and colleagues as an intensely private, soft-spoken man, almost the opposite of the loud, jittery characters he played for a living. Reports from people who worked with him describe someone who dealt with real anxiety and, at various points, symptoms consistent with hypochondria, meaning persistent, health-related worry that went beyond normal concern. He also developed a degenerative eye condition later in life that gradually affected his vision, a particularly hard blow for a performer whose career had depended so heavily on expressive timing and reading a room. In 1999, Don did something that surprised even some of his own fans. He published an autobiography titled Barney Fife and Other Characters I Have Known, opening up in his own words about his career, his insecurities, and the anxious personality that had shaped so much of his work. For a man widely described as shy and guarded about his private life, the book was a rare moment of him speaking directly, in his own voice, about who he really was behind the characters people loved. As Don entered his 80s, his health began to decline more seriously. Around the year 2004, he developed pulmonary fibrosis, a serious lung condition, and doctors soon discovered lung cancer as well. According to biographer Daniel DeVice, who later wrote extensively about Don and Andy Griffith's friendship, Don kept his diagnosis extremely private. He didn't want word getting out that he was sick, worried that it might affect his ability to keep working. By most accounts, he didn't even tell his own children that he was dying, choosing instead to keep pursuing roles and public appearances for as long as he possibly could, including voice work in Disney's Chicken Little and a return appearance on that 70s show. He wanted, it seems, to keep being the man who made people laugh for as long as his body would let him. That determination held until nearly the very end. Don Knotts died on February 24, 2006, at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, from pulmonary and respiratory complications related to his lung cancer. He was 81 years old. His longtime friend Andy Griffith came to see him in his final hours. Griffith later described holding Don's hand, telling him he loved him, and believing that Don, even then, could still hear his voice. Don's wife and daughter remained by his side until the end. The friendship that began decades earlier on a television soundstage in the early 1960s had lasted, quietly and genuinely, all the way to the final hours of his life. In the years since his passing, much of what the public has come to understand about the private man behind Barney Fife has come through his daughter, Karen Knotts. Karen has written and spoken publicly, including in her own memoir about growing up as his daughter, about what it was like to be raised by a man so beloved on screen and so reserved off of it. Through her writing and interviews, she's described her father as someone who dealt with genuine nervousness and self-doubt his entire life, someone whose on-screen persona wasn't entirely a performance so much as an exaggeration of who he already was. She's also spoken warmly about his sense of humor staying with him even during his hardest years, describing a father who kept trying to make the people around him smile, right up until his illness made that difficult. None of this amounts to some hidden scandal the family covered up for 2 decades. It's something both simpler and, in its own way, more moving. A naturally shy, anxious man built an extraordinary career by turning his own vulnerabilities into something the whole world could laugh with, rather than at. He did it while dealing with real personal struggles that he mostly kept to himself, at least until he chose, in his own autobiography, to share some of that story on his own terms. And after his death, his daughter continued that honesty, helping fans see her father not just as Barney Fife or Ralph Furley, but as a complicated, deeply human man who happened to be extraordinarily good at making people feel better. Looking back across his entire life, what stands out isn't a secret or a scandal. It's the persistence of a working-class kid from Morgantown who turned childhood shyness into ventriloquism, wartime performances into a real career, and a lifetime of private anxiety into some of the most beloved comic performances in American television history. He won 5 Emmy Awards for a character built almost entirely out of nervous energy. He kept working through canceled shows, underwhelming box office numbers, failing eyesight, and a cancer diagnosis he never even told his own kids about, because performing and making people laugh was simply who he was. Don Knotts spent his career being loved for playing a man who couldn't quite hold himself together. In reality, he held an enormous amount together, quietly, for most of his life. That's not a rumor. That's not a 20-year-old secret finally being confirmed. That's simply the honest, well-documented story of a man who gave people joy while carrying real weight of his own, a story his own daughter has continued to tell with clear-eyed love rather than sensational reveal. So, after learning the real story behind the man who played Barney Fife, does it change how you see him? Does knowing how much genuine anxiety and self-doubt lived behind that famous nervous smile make his career feel even more remarkable? Let us know what you think, and if you enjoyed learning the real story behind Don Knotts, like and subscribe for more honest looks at the people behind your favorite classic television characters.